Those were the days.
Hey y'all, Justin Lee Howard here with another edition of Those Were Days Extended. Today I am actually taking you back to March 9th, 2017, when Eli tells Julie that he is her grandson. And this, of course, comes on the heels of Julie grieving over her son David, who's Eli's father, who was just killed. So yeah, I kind of wanted to kind of go down a little bit of a rabbit hole and explore specifically just this relationship and what it has done for both characters coming onto the show. I think we are all just big fans of Julie, of course, and then Eli coming on in 2017 and just kind of opening up this really, I would say, really wonderful pairing that has happened between these two, and just want to give you a little bit of context for where both of these characters are coming from and how they meet. Specifically, we're kind of going to start with Eli's conception here, or kind of where he came from. And Eli, if you don't know, he is the product of Valerie Grant and David Banning, who is Julie's son. They were actually dubbed America's first daytime TV interracial romance. This started in 75 on Days, if you were watching back then. Sort of this storyline happens where Valerie is sort of from this really nice family in Salem, and her brother sort of stumbles upon this car accident victim who's David. He sort of brings her back to the family home to like recuperate and for them to like nurse him back to health. But they sort of get to know David. They decide to basically, he's sort of not in hiding, but he's sort of keeping a low profile, so the family kind of is taken with him and they agree to sort of hide him out in their family home a bit. And during this time, Valerie and David kind of continue to sort of get these feelings for one another. Interesting enough, this was a really slow burn for this couple. And we'll get into that. Again, they had many obstacles, everything from ex-girlfriends to some baby mama drama. And then the biggest obstacle I'd say in their coupledom was that there were a lot of these unevolved opinions about interracial relationships, especially back then. And sort of Days was not afraid to kind of tackle it in one way. I think they dropped the ball a little bit in some other ways, which we'll get into. But one of those unevolved opinions was actually David's mother, one of our favorites, Julie, who was not so keen at the time of this relationship between Valerie and her son. But again, like I said, this relationship played out for about 3 years on the show. Again, it was an incredibly slow burn to sort of get these two people together, and they actually winded up engaged. They never consummated sort of the engagement. And a lot of that came from, there was a lot of backlash about this relationship. Again, it was 1975. It was a different time. This is sort of one of soap's sort of heydays, or their biggest heydays, after sort of debuting in the 60s and having this track run for about, at this point with Days, about 10 years. But they got a lot of backlash and a lot of flack for sort of portraying this interracial couple. Because of that, this relationship sort of fizzled out on the show. I think it's near and dear to some people who remember it, but what didn't sort of go down as one of, they weren't a super couple. It didn't go down as sort of this great relationship between others. And part of that had to do with the backlash and sort of the hate Days received. And again, Valerie soon left the canvas. David sticked around for a few more years, and then he unfortunately left the canvas and hasn't really been back since. So I think that sort of put the kibosh on this relationship, or the lore of this relationship. But they actually did try and do a resurrection for this. I think the powers that be saw what they had, at least, and then they brought Valerie back sort of in the early 80s when David was still around on the show. But again, they were just kind of really timid and tepid to go there with this couple for some reason. It sort of kept them on the sidelines. When the second iteration of them coming back in the early 80s, it was them as like confidant slash best friends. They sort of stayed away from them two as a couple. And so, yeah, that's sort of the lore, or where sort of Eli came from. Those are his parents. Again, we learned that in this sort of next iteration, when we had Vanessa Williams sort of come to the show as Valerie. Oh, excuse me. Come to the show as Valerie. Again, she comes to the show. She's consulting on an old flame, Abe's case. And then she runs into Julie, who she still kind of harbors a little bit of resentment towards at that time for sort of her incomplete sort of lack of support for her and David back then. I think a lot of people finding that out now were a bit surprised by that. Julie always seemed sort of evolved and ahead of her time, but even back then, the interracial relationships were really new to some people. She wasn't sort of against Valerie at the time. I think a lot of it was, this is fairly new. Maybe you guys you don't know sort of the tough road ahead you have for each other. So there was a little bit of bad blood, especially on Valerie's side, and how she felt like Julie kind of maybe could have kind of changed the trajectory of her relationship with David, and maybe she could have ended up with him if they had a little bit more support from Julie and the Hortons back then. But yeah, we saw that not only does Valerie sort of bring herself back and acclimate herself to Salem, where she grew up and was born, but she also brings a grown son, Eli, back, and we learn, of course, Eli is the son of David. And I liked what they did here when they introduced Eli and played by Lamont Archie here in his first few scenes. I think we, the audience, were suspecting this big sort of paternity storyline, and we were going to go back and forth with Valerie sort of keeping him from the Hortons and, not talking about David, and was he going to stumble upon the Hortons and find out about David and all this kind of stuff. And then they sort of nipped that right in the bud. In one of his first few scenes on the show, he basically confronts Valerie and tells her he knows that that basically his childhood was he was raised by Valerie and a stepfather named Terrence till the age of 6 when Terrence was killed in the line of duty. And Eli has always known that his mom was concealing who his actual biological father was the whole time. And so when he comes on the scene again, we're expecting this paternity storyline to play out. It doesn't. He basically confronts her head on and is like, I know who my father is, or I know, you haven't told me who my father is. I know that I am biracial at this point. And he basically confronts Valerie, saying he assumes it's David, and he's sort of waiting for her to be honest with him and tell him the truth. She eventually does, which again then leads to that infamous scene of Eli going to Julie, who he's met at this point, and letting her know that he is in fact her grandson. Which brings us to, again, one of, I would say, the best pairings we've got in the last few years of this pairing of Julie and Eli. I think this pairing has really resonated with people over the years. I think we've seen it ever since Lamont Archie came on. I think this connection he has with Susan is really sweet. And in the press, they both talk about each other, and they have this very loving familiarity with one another. He thinks of Susan and Bill at the time as sort of surrogate grandparents, and she's talked about how wonderful he is to do scenes in, and how wonderful it is to see Julie in some sort of mother mode, which we haven't seen in so long on the show. So I think that is what people have always connected with and resonated with these two. I think from a character standpoint, we saw Eli come on again. Not only did it bring another viable male character to the show, which we desperately needed at the time. It goes through these periods where they're short of, I feel like, men in a certain age group, and we don't get that. So again, we had Eli come onto the show. It was also the building out of the more Black characters to the canvas and what that meant and how we see that now on the show. I think tying Eli to the Hortons and Julie specifically was a great nod to their history of Valerie and David. I think for Julie, what it did was it brought in that like matriarch role that she had. We saw it sort of creeping up in the last few years, but I think she's fully cemented herself in that role, taking over for Alice. I think for a while she was very in and out. So she was, Julie was the fun relative, the take no charge, the sort of older cousin auntie role who kind of came in like a storm and shook some things up and then left town. But since she's sort of permanently been in Salem, we've seen her take over that matriarch role that sort of Alice used to have, but in a very different way. But again, we've seen these relationships, especially with the Horn family. We saw it with Julie and Nick. We saw it with Alice and Lucas. We saw it a little bit with even Julie and Lucas, or Maggie and Lucas, kind of play out over the years. So again, this one just resonated with audience and allowed Susan to play just a different instrument. And I think it came at a really great time. It sort of coincided with sort of her real life husband, Bill Hayes, of course, who passed away. We sort of coincide with his scenes declining on the show, due to his health reasons. So it was another way for Julie to have this sort of significant scene partner who she had this really like amazing camaraderie with. So yeah, I think fans really just they took to that. And we see that play out to this day with, when the character of Doug passing away and Eli and Lonnie coming back and the relationship that they have. Eli's very protective for her. She's very loving towards him and very close with him. The one criticism I would have about this is that when they brought Eli on, I think they concentrated so much of it with putting him with Julie and developing that relationship, which again, totally paid off. We see what it is. We love it. But I don't think they did such a great job with integrating him with the rest of the Horton clan. And I've said this throughout the years, like I wish that we would have had a male version of like the best friend relationship that like Hope and Jennifer have. I wish we would have had that with like Eli and Lucas. And I wish, we would have had more family scenes with like Abigail or Sarah. We had some stuff with him and JJ as cousins, but a lot of that was just centered around with Lonnie being in the middle of them and Gabby being in the middle of them. So, that was sort of a different angle to take with him. But I really wish that they would have integrated him a little bit more with the Hortons. But I think what we did get is the primary relationship, which of course is him and Julie, and how I think that just jumped across the scene. And again, it always comes across very loving, very touching. And I think it means a little bit more now that we don't have Bill Hayes on the scenes anymore. So it's always a welcome when Limo and Archie comes back and we get to see, Eli and Julie together again. So yeah, that was this week's Those Were the Days Extended, and see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Those were the days.